Today draws on a paper by Christopher Jenks. After class, you'll want to read these 5 pages of the paper. You should also complete problem set 0. It's a real quick problem set that makes sure you have R and RStudio installed on your computer. Let's start by talking a bit about quantitative evidence about inequality. When we think about inequality, we often think about distributions. Here's the distribution of US household incomes in 2022. In this distribution, we have a histogram where there are many bins for different income values. The height of the bars shows you how many households fall in each bin. We see that many households have household incomes below $100,000 per year. A few households have very high household incomes. The top 1% are not even shown on this graph. When we see a distribution, often it's helpful to make some numerical summaries. For example, the median is a measure of central tendency. It's the value such that half of households earn less and half of households earn more. Another summary would be other quantiles of the distribution. For example, the 90th percentile, here about $212,000, is the value such that 90% of households have an income lower than this value. In green, we have the 10th percentile. This is the value such that 10% of households have an income lower than this value. We might think of the blue as typical earnings for high-income households and the green as typical earnings for low-income households. With that language, we might say that high-income households get 14 times as much as low-income households. When you see a statistic like that about inequality, it often leads to normative arguments. Is this the kind of inequality we want? In class, we're going to pause and do a little activity. Which income distribution would you prefer? On the left, we have the distribution that exists, and on the right, we have another hypothetical distribution. Every household gets $70,181. Which would you prefer? When we think about which distribution to prefer, it's often helpful to abstract away from the facts and think about some of our principles for making these choices. In the Jenks paper, he draws on the example of God sending manna from heaven to the Israelites wandering in the desert. The Israelites were wandering around in the desert and they had no food. They were starving. So God caused this bread-like substance to fall from heaven. In this example, the manna, it just drops from heaven. We might think that the first pound is more helpful than the second pound. If you're starving, you really need that first pound of manna. The second, still pretty nice. The third starts to become more than you can eat. And so when we think about how we should distribute the manna, we might think that given these diminishing returns, we should try to maximize everyone's well-being. There's no use giving more manna to someone who's already got a ton of manna. We should give it to the person who has none. Thus, perhaps we should distribute the manna equally. Now let's change the example. In the example before, manna just dropped from heaven. Now let's suppose people work for their manna. We have an economy where people generate the manna by being productive and engaging in work activities. Now you might make a different argument, one that could help to justify inequality. Under this argument, we might say, well, we need unequal rewards. It needs to be possible that you can get much more manna than someone else by working lots of hours or being particularly innovative. Perhaps that work and innovation, it helps everyone, makes the economy more efficient so that even the person who has the least, they maybe have more under a high inequality regime than they would under a low inequality regime. These kinds of arguments are often the subject of political debates and conceptual disagreements. What I like about the Jenks paper is that it points out that some of these arguments can actually be tested empirically. Empirically, is it the case that more unequal places have higher well-being than places that are more equal? In the paper, he presents data in a table, and here I've turned them into a figure. For each country in this plot, we have an x-axis variable, inequality in that country, measured as the ratio of those high earners to the low earners. In the US, in the data Jenks is studying, which are considerably older than the data that started this lecture, the top earners had, about 5.5 times the income of the bottom earners. In other countries, there's much greater equality. So like in Sweden and Finland over here, it's more like 2.5 times. On the y-axis, we have the gross domestic product per capita, presented as a percent of the US GDP. So we see here that like Norway in these data was about 85% as productive as the US. And so when you look across these countries, you might be able to make an argument. It looks like the countries that have higher inequality, they are in fact more productive. It seems that perhaps if we allow inequality, this will spur innovation and more work effort so that we have higher GDP. That might lift all boats and make everyone better off. But a skeptic then could also look at the data and say, well, when I look at this, what I really see is that there's one group of countries over here at the left that has a moderate amount of inequality and a moderate amount of GDP. And then I have the US, way up here in the top right. The US is far more unequal than the other countries in this comparison and has far higher GDP than the other countries. If you want to argue that inequality is beneficial for GDP, your argument entirely hinges on the case of the US. This is a nice example because it takes substantive and normative arguments about inequality and it pairs them with empirical evidence. The empirical evidence doesn't necessarily answer the normative arguments, but it certainly lays the bounds on what kinds of things we can begin discussing. It helps us to reason about how credible various theories might be. I like to start with this paper because that's a key goal of this course. I hope that by the end of the course, you're able to make some arguments about inequality and connect those arguments to quantitative empirical evidence.